Why don't we have a tabernacle today? Why don't we have a big tent that God comes down and meets us in? Why did he allow the temple, the final phase of that, why did he allow the temple to be destroyed? And why is there not a temple now with sacrifices continuing? Well, as we walk through this text, we find a lot of answers in the book of Hebrews. Remember, the book of Hebrews is designed as a bit of an apologetic to try to help the Hebrews and the Jewish people understand that Christ fulfilled the tabernacle, fulfilled the Old Testament. Listen to Hebrews chapter 8. It says, now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, and that's Jesus. We have a high priest. This high priest is not walking in and out on one day a year. What is he? He's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. And so what we saw in this tabernacle was a mercy seat. This was the gold lid to the ark, and it was there that they would place the blood, but it was also there in symbol that his presence would literally be there like a throne. But our great high priest is seated at the right hand of the throne, where in heaven. He is a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up and not man. So what we hear here is that this tent, this tabernacle, was not the true tent. It was a symbolic tent. It was a miniature version. It was a travel tent for God. But it is a replica or a picture for us to dwell on and think about what the real tent, and that's the throne room of heaven, is like. Look at verse 4. Now, if Jesus were on earth, he would not be a priest at all because he wasn't of the lineage of Aaron. He couldn't have even been a priest like that, since there are priests who offers gifts according to the law. But these old priests, they serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. So what I think that the tabernacle and study of the tabernacle does for us is a number of things. Number one, it ought to get us excited about heaven and being in the very presence of God one day. What an incredible moment that's going to be. But it also ought to most of all get us excited about Jesus. I want to bring these diagrams back from last week, and if you weren't here last week, you're in for a treat. This is Mount Sinai. Just go with me conceptually. And what we had is we had all the people. We couldn't touch the mountain. Just the normal average folks, we couldn't even come up. We were at the base of the mountain looking upwards. And then there were some representatives who could go about midway up to base camp. And we saw the elders, and we saw Aaron, and we saw Moses and Joshua. But then Moses was the only one who went up 40 days and 40 nights into the top of this, where the very presence of God was there in smoke and in fire. Very scary place. And the warning was, don't even touch the mountain. And so we struggled because there was heaven on earth, but we couldn't be there. We couldn't get to it. Even when we were consecrated with the blood of the sacrifices, we were separated, but we have a mediator. And this mediator Moses went up into this place, this little nook that he could kind of be in the presence of God, if you know the story there. And it was there that our mediator Moses at that time could interact with God and hear God, but even in a somewhat limited basis because of who God is and his holiness and his sovereignty. And it was there that he said, I want you to make a little miniature version of this mountaintop experience, and we're going to call it the tabernacle. And then we get the tabernacle design, and you see this on the next slide, and it was basically in this shape, from east to west and north to south. And you see that it's got the same idea. You have the courtyard, and the normal people could come in, but the first thing that they entered into and saw was an altar. They could go no further than the altar because it was there that they had the sacrifices, and then the courtyard. But the first thing at the very entrance, you had to deal with sin. But the people were separated from the holy place in the interior of the tabernacle. So that holy place and the Holy of Holies were for special representatives, priests. And the priests could go into the holy place, and they would keep the bread fresh, and they would keep the oil going, and they would make sure that everything was taken care of in there. But then there was one mediator, just like the mountain, but now the mediator would be a high priest of the descendants of Aaron. And this high priest was the only one who could enter behind that blue veil into the Holy of Holies and place a sacrifice for the sins of the whole camp, of all of the people there on the mercy seat once a year. So God's getting closer. He says, I want to dwell among my people. So I'm going to come off of this mountain, and you're going to make a house for me, a place for me to meet with you so that people can see. But they're still separate. They can only come but so close, and the only way they can get somewhat close to God is to come with a sacrifice, a substitute sacrifice to cover their sin. Isn't it incredible? God wants to be with us. And God is making a way. He's coming closer. But when we see that bit of heaven on earth in tabernacle form, we realize we no longer have that. What we have is so much superior. Look at John chapter 1 with me. John chapter 1. When we look at the purpose of God coming off of the mountain to dwell with his people, God with us, we see this is the actual purpose of Jesus. Jesus came to reveal to us the nature of God, to tabernacle and live among his creatures so that we could experience the presence of God in an even closer way. John 1 puts it in an incredible way. It says, the Word, which was God, is God. We see that in John 1:1. That Word became flesh and took up residence. I like this version that says, took up residence among us. And we observed his glory, the glory as of the only, one and only Son from the Father, full of two things, what? Grace and truth. But we observed him. And so it's still in observational mode. Moses observed, and the people could observe God up on the mountain. They could observe the tabernacle, and now they are observing the tabernacling and tenting of God in a human body. They're seeing this in the person of Christ. And in verse 16, it says, indeed, we have received grace after grace from his fullness. For the law was given through Moses, that first mediator, but now we have a new mediator. And what do we get through our new mediator, Jesus? Grace and truth came through Jesus. No one has ever seen God. Even Moses was veiled from the actual form of God. No one has ever seen God. The one and only Son, the one who is at the Father's side, he has revealed him. He's made him known.